So, the structure of this episode is going to be a bit different than usual because what we're doing here today is a responsio or a polemic, however you want to look at it. In so many words, this is essential salts contra Jordan Peterson on how to interpret Nietzsche, or more specifically, how to interpret Nietzsche's project of what Peterson calls values creation. So, to begin with, I'm going to read a transcript of statements that Peterson has made in his 2016 personality lecture. This is part 9, and it's abridged. I've only included the relevant statements to what we're talking about, and I've removed all the filler words and kind of cleaned up the transcript a little bit. After this, we'll have a sense of Jordan's claims about Nietzsche, and for the rest of the episode after that, I'm going to respond. But I'm going to devote a lot more of this episode than usual to simply reading Nietzsche's own words. It's going to be a very source-heavy episode, rather than interpreting and giving commentary, which I will do a little bit more so at the end. But I think the necessary commentary is minimal, and there is a wealth of material in Nietzsche's notes especially that, in my opinion, just refutes Jordan Peterson's interpretation on the face of it. So without further ado, here is Jordan's interpretation from that lecture, which will be linked in the description. Quote, Nietzsche talked about the development of the being he called the Overman, which is often translated as Superman, and his idea was that people would have to take onto themselves the burden of creating new systems of meaning and new moralities that were suited to them, that they would have to create new values. The Nietzschean idea is that it's possible for human beings to create their own values. Now, there's a problem with that, and there's a variety of problems with that, and one is that it doesn't exactly seem true. If you come up with your system of values, and I come up with mine, there's no reason to assume that they're going to be sufficiently integratable so that we don't have to fight each other to the death. That's a big problem. You'd have every single person with their own system of beliefs. That's a structured kind of philosophical anarchy. Well, okay, maybe that's good if you happen to live alone on an island, but if you're stuck with all these other people, then that becomes a very difficult thing to manage. There's another problem with the idea that people should create their own values, and that is that it's not so simple. The problem seems to be that you don't obey yourself very well. You can say, here's my code, I'm going to live by it. You say, well, I'm going to study very hard and do well at my classes. But you procrastinate, and you have a paper you're supposed to read, and you know you're supposed to read it, and you need to read it for reasons that are important to you, but there's no damn way you can get yourself to sit down and read it. Your attention wanders, and you go to do 3 or 4 stupid things, and you feel terrible about it, like you feel like you're betraying yourself, and maybe this is a continual pattern in your life. But one of the things you find out is that you don't get to create your own damn values, because for some reason you're not in charge of yourself, and of course that's where the psychoanalytic ideas start to come from. There's many sub-yous inside of you, and they don't all want the same thing. The idea that you can generate your own meaning is an insufficiently developed idea, because there's a lot of meaning-making generators residing within you, and not only do they not all point in the same direction, which is a huge problem, but they don't even necessarily lay themselves out in some integrated fashion across time, and they don't necessarily operate together in a way that's going to enable you to find your place with other people and in society. End quote. So again, I cut out a lot, but those are all Jordan's words, and that is Jordan Peterson's reading of Nietzsche that many of you are probably familiar with because he's made reiterations or elaborations on these statements many times over the years. And there are many problems with Jordan's reading, and I've broken it up into 4 different critiques I'm going to make for the purposes of this episode. First, Jordan and Nietzsche are talking about 2 different things when they talk about values. Secondly, Jordan's understanding of what creating values means differs from what Nietzsche says about what creating values means. Third, all of the apparent problems that Jordan raises in this lecture cease to be problems once you have a coherent reading of Nietzsche's philosophy. And finally, this is more of a minor point, Jordan's understanding of the role of the Overman seems to be mistaken as well. So, first of all, the first issue. Jordan Peterson and Nietzsche are talking about two fundamentally different things when they talk about values. Jordan's conception of values seems to be the colloquial understanding of values, which might be what is invoked when we talk about moral values, or even, say, family values, values used in that sense of the word. So, for Jordan, values are a consciously determined set of principles. It's an ethical standard that you adopt voluntarily as an act of the will, and to which you attempt to conform your behavior. So in so many words, values for Jordan would seem to be almost synonymous with morals, and his definition seems to include the philosophical baggage that is important to his project, mainly the infusion of terms such as meaning. Now, Nietzsche's conception of values is quite different. First of all, Nietzsche does not conceive of moral values as the only kind of values. See Will to Power, number 1006, quote, "Hitherto, moral values have been the highest values. Does anybody doubt this? If we bring down the values from their pedestal, we thereby alter all values. The principle of their order of rank, which has prevailed hitherto, is thus overthrown." End quote. So obviously, from this passage, moral values have been placed at the top of the order of rank of values, and Nietzsche suggests that we could overthrow that order and presumably place other values atop the hierarchy of value. Other values besides moral values. And that would mean that values are not synonymous with morals for Nietzsche. In fact, values are more fundamental than morality. Morality is, we might say, the abstraction, the reification, the universalization of values. So in other words, a value for Nietzsche could become consciously expressed as moral, but it could also become consciously expressed any number of other ways. Perhaps we could say aesthetic, cultural, social. There could potentially be many different ways of expressing values, which none of them are fundamental. They're all signifiers. And what is really being signified is a valuation. That's the long form of the word value for Nietzsche. That's what's meant by the word value in Nietzsche's philosophy. A valuation is what? It's an estimation of worth. A valuation is the judgment of a given underlying instinct, a drive, that's what's making the judgment, about the worth or the value of something. And these valuations are not rationally derived. They are not created by the consciousness. They are laundered through the consciousness, but they're not created by it. And we could see Beyond Good and Evil, Book 1, Section 3, quote, "Behind all logic, in its seeming sovereignty of movement, there are valuations, or to speak more plainly, physiological demands for the maintenance of a definite mode of life." End quote. So two key concepts here. Valuations are physiological, and valuations are demands. And demands for what? Well, the maintenance or the preservation of a certain modus vivendi, a way of living. In other words, like all organisms, human beings are driven by instinct to seek certain conditions, to seek those conditions which foster their survival or their flourishing. And upon finding what those conditions are, we come to value those conditions. We make a positive valuation of them. So you might see Will to Power, number 685, quote, "The standpoint of value is the same as that of the conditions of preservation and enhancement in regard to complex creatures of relative stability appearing in the course of evolution." End quote. So what are the factors that would shape how an organism or a group of organisms values, how it does its valuing? Nietzsche would say that these factors are physical and physiological. The valuations of an organism spring from its own necessities, so to speak, the demands that are placed upon it by life and by its environment. We might say by what the organism is and what is around it. So in Ecce Homo, Why I Am So Clever, this is part 10, quote, "These trivial matters, diet, locality, climate, and one's mode of recreation, the whole casuistry of self-love, are inconceivably more important than all that which has hitherto been held in high esteem. It is precisely in this quarter that we must begin to learn afresh." End quote. Furthermore, according to Nietzsche, groups tend to define their valuations in contrast to those of their enemies. This is part of Nietzsche's assertion that every form of life is, we might say, arbitrary, unjust, aimed at becoming different from other forms of life. This is from Zarathustra's 1001 Goals. Quote, Much that seemed good to one people was regarded with scorn and contempt by another. Thus I found. Much that was called evil in one place was in another decked with purple honors. One neighbor never understood another. His soul always marveled at his neighbor's madness and wickedness. A tablet of the good hangs over every people. Behold, it is the tablet of their overcomings. Behold, it is the voice of their will to power. Truly, my brother, if you only knew what peoples need and land and sky and neighbor, you could surely divine the law of its overcomings and why it climbs up that ladder to its hope. Truly, men have given to themselves all their good and evil. Truly, they did not take it, they did not find it, it did not come to them as a voice from heaven. End quote. So there's a lot in that passage, but the main points. Values did not spring into being, right? It's not something that mankind passively discovered. Values don't refer to eternal truths. And like other natural phenomena, values had to develop over a long course of time. It's also clear from this passage that values can neither be absolute or universal. I mean, such a prospect would fly in the face of Nietzsche's entire project of perspectivism. Instead, values are relative, reflective of the nature and the necessity of those who hold them, and contingent, dependent on changing and external factors, such as conditions necessary for the flourishing or enhancement or survivability of human life. And obviously, there can be many possible sets of conditions that human beings could thrive in and thus come to value. And that's precisely why they contrast themselves with their neighbors and rivals in terms of what they value, because they are testing one another for whose way of life is more survivable, more enhancing of the type human being, right? So we have values which are relative, yes, contingent, yes, but physical and in fact physiological demands. And following from this, man as a conscious animal, right? Man is the rational animal, the thinking animal, would then make conscious these valuations and establish these valuations as a law over the community. And it is at this point that we have the creation of morality. This is Will to Power number 514, quote, "A moral, that is to say, a method of living which long experience and experiment have tested and proved efficient, at last enters consciousness as a law, as dominant. And then the whole group of related values and conditions become part of it. It becomes venerable, unassailable, holy, true. A necessary part of its evolution is that its origin should be forgotten. That is a sign that it has become master." End quote. So there's a great flaw involved in this operation of making values into morals, and that is that consciousness, for Nietzsche, is primarily a tool of communication between human beings, and conscious thought is advantageous precisely because it allows for groups of humans to communicate and coordinate, but because of that, it inclines toward the advantage of the collective rather than towards the advantage of the individual. And it creates and expresses the concepts which are useful on the collective level. And this is in Beyond Good and Evil, Book 5, number 199, quote, "Inasmuch as in all ages, as long as mankind has existed, there have also been human herds, family alliances, communities, tribes, peoples, states, churches, and always a great number who obey in proportion to the small number who command. In view, therefore, of the fact that obedience has been most practiced and fostered among mankind hitherto, one may reasonably suppose that, generally speaking, the need thereof is now innate in everyone, as a kind of formal conscience which gives the command, thou shalt unconditionally do something, unconditionally refrain from something. In short, thou shalt. This need tries to satisfy itself and to fill its form with a content. According to its strength, impatience, and eagerness, it at once seizes as an omnivorous appetite with little selection, and accepts whatever is shouted into its ear by all sorts of commanders, parents, teachers, laws, class prejudices, or public opinion." End quote. So this understanding of how moral values are created will be very important as we move forward. But the key point to understand is that Nietzsche sees mankind as developing an instinct for obedience as a consequence of living within the social order. The conscious world is a world imposed upon by collective judgments, which is to say, the valuations made on a collective rather than individual level. And he goes on to say in this passage that even those who act as leaders of the society generally have to justify themselves by presenting themselves as mere instruments of the public will or of the common good. But we should notice here, at no point in Nietzsche's conception of values does he ever present values as voluntarily adopted on the individual level, as a function of reason, right? Because on the physiological level, even a strictly individual and unique value, we might say, would still be a demand and not a voluntary exercise of the will, right? In the way that think about your drives and impulses. That's where values really come from, right? And it would be a demand in the way that hunger is a demand. And so it's not a moral imperative in that sense. And to the extent that values do become moralized, which is the process that we've been sketching out here, this is not as a function of, voluntarily adopting it, by an individual will as a part of a rational choice. Because what's really happening is the physical and physiological conditions that obtain over the entire community, which are experienced as, external forces, right? That's what fosters the strength of a given value. And that's what the community then transmutes into a moral value. So to put this in straightforward language, it's not a rational choice whether the Bedouin tribesmen living a nomadic existence in the harsh environment of the desert, in vicious competition with other tribes for their very survival. It's not a rational choice whether they are going to value something like bravery or whether they're going to value something like self-sacrifice. Those traits are, in some sense, unquestionably valuable to the Bedouin collective, we might say. And the process by which one who does not live up to this value has his behavior adjusted to that value, it's not on the level of rational argument, right, or moral imperative. It might become expressed as a moral imperative later on, but the conditions of their very existence select against it. And so, to summarize, the creation and the development of values is for Nietzsche a natural process and a physiological process, and one which can be more helpfully understood as a tension of competing forces, rather than a dialogue between competing moral philosophies. That's just not what it is. In the same way that the Greeks and the Persians didn't have a dialogue about which one of their tablets of values was the appropriate one to hold. The norm historically is to have a violent competition to determine these things, but we'll get to that in a little bit. For right now, though, all of this is why Jordan doesn't understand. The fact that he doesn't understand what a value is in Nietzsche's philosophy is why he's making a category error when he talks about, quote-unquote, creating values, because he doesn't understand what that means to Nietzsche. This is the second major problem with his interpretation, second major critique I'll make here. The way Jordan talks about this, conversation about creating values, a major problem with it is that it only seems to arise in response to the death of God. And I've already covered Jordan Peterson's misunderstanding about the death of God in other videos. I'll include a link in the description if you'd like to hear more about this topic. The important thing for our purposes here is that Jordan tends to bring up Nietzsche's challenge to create our own values as if it's something that Nietzsche believed might happen in the future, right? It could happen in response to the death of God. And this is very clear when we see the connection to the Overman in his interpretation. In Jordan's reading, it's the Overman who will create values at some point in the future. And this is a novel task, like a new task for mankind that was not necessary before the death of God. In other words, as Jordan interprets it, and largely correctly, the collapse of the central orienting value structure of the West, right? But this is another misreading because Nietzsche thinks that mankind has created its own values many times in the past, as he says in Zarathustra's 3 Metamorphoses of the Spirit. And this passage is, the famous allegory of the camel, the lion, and the child. So Nietzsche is writing with metaphors here, but so it will explain some of the background metaphors before I read this section of the passage. So he names the first phase of psychological development that he's talking about, in which one attempts to take on the many past ideas of mankind and carry them, so to speak. Nietzsche uses the metaphor of the camel. And then he suggests that in order to proceed in one's development, you have to turn against these past traditions, utter a no even against sacred duties and obligations. He names that phase by the metaphor of the lion. But sort of paired with that metaphor of the lion, another metaphor he uses to kind of oppose against the lion is the dragon, a great beast with shimmering golden scales, each of which is inscribed with the words, "Thou shalt." The dragon's representative of those collective, traditionally passed down moral values, which the lion has to attack in order to move forward. So Nietzsche writes in that passage, quote, "What is the great dragon which the spirit no longer wants to call Lord and God? The great dragon is called thou shalt. But the spirit of the lion says, I will. Thou shalt lies in its path, sparkling with gold, a scale-covered beast, and on every scale glitters golden, thou shalt. Values of 1,000 years glitter on the scales, and thus speaks the mightiest of all dragons. All the values of things glitter on me. All values have already been created, and all created values are in me. Truly there shall be no more, I will. Thus speaks the dragon. To create new values, even the lion is incapable of that, but to create freedom for itself, and a sacred no even to duty, the lion is needed for that, my brothers. To seize the right to new values. That is the most terrible proceeding for a weight-bearing and reverential spirit. Truly, to this spirit, it is a theft and a work for an animal of prey. Once it loved thou shalt as its holiest thing. Now it has to find illusion and caprice even in the holiest, that it may steal freedom from its love. The lion is needed for this theft." End quote. So every thou shalt was once an I will. In other words, every moral dictate presented as an eternal and universal law, binding on all, was once simply the statement of a value, an arbitrary and a physiological demand for a certain way of life. In other words, it was the expression of a drive or an impulse, or we might say a will. And Nietzsche believes, furthermore, that these thou shalts were not fashioned democratically, but by the activity of those he calls lawgivers. But also he uses different names like commanders, legislators, self-legislators. It all refers to the same thing. In fact, Nietzsche believes this activity of law-giving is the real reason for being of the philosopher. That this legislative activity represents the highest aspiration of the philosophical mind. The type of philosophical mind that doesn't just merely survey the ideas of their time and place, but reorders and reorients them. In other words, enacts a revaluation. And a revaluation is really what Nietzsche is describing when we talk about creating values, as Jordan always puts it. There's a lengthy passage in Will to Power. He gives two examples for such figures of legislators, Plato and Muhammad. This is Will to Power number 972. Quote, "The lawgivers of the future, after having tried for a long time in vain to attach a particular meaning to the word philosopher, for I found many antagonistic traits, I recognized that we can distinguish between two kinds of philosophers. One, those who desire to establish any large system of values, logical or moral. Two, those who are the lawgivers of such valuations. The former try to seize upon the world of the present or the past by embodying or abbreviating the multifarious phenomena by means of signs. Their object is to make it possible for us to survey, to reflect upon, to comprehend, and to utilize everything that has happened hitherto. They serve the purpose of man by using all past things to the benefit of his future. The second class, however, are commanders. They say, 'Thus shall it be.' They alone determine the whither and the wherefore, and that which will be useful and beneficial to man. They have command over the previous work of scientific men, and all knowledge is to them only a means to their creations. This second kind of philosopher seldom appears. How often have they not intentionally blindfolded their eyes in order to shut out the sight of the small strip of ground which separates them from the abyss and from utter destruction? Plato, for instance, when he persuaded himself that the good as he wanted it was not Plato's good, but the good in itself, the eternal treasure which a certain man of the name Plato had chanced to find on his way. This same will to blindness prevails in a much coarser form in the case of the founders of religion. There thou shalt must on no account sound to their ears like I will. They only dare to pursue their task as if under the command of God. Their legislation of values can only be a burden they can bear if they regard it as revelation. In this way, their conscience is not crushed by the responsibility. As soon as those two comforting expedients, that of Plato and that of Muhammad, have been overthrown, and no thinker can any longer relieve his conscience with the hypothesis, God or eternal values, the claim of the lawgiver to determine new values rises to an awfulness which has not yet been experienced." End quote. So, in other words, the legislator or the lawgiver, Whether he's a founder of a great philosophy or a world religion, he proceeds by misleading others, and indeed misleading even himself as to the nature of values. Rather than presenting his value as an I will, he presents it as a thou shalt. Rather than presenting the good as Plato's good, Plato presents it as the good in itself. Muhammad doesn't present this as my revelation, it's God's revelation. So the legislators of value are artistic in this way. They distort reality. They turn these physiological demands for the preservation of a certain way of life into a powerful and unquestionable abstraction. And so, in other words, morality is an artistic product, and the artistry in creating or legislating moral values is in the fact that the value is being transmuted from that physical demand into an idea. And here, the double meaning with the Platonic sense of the word, idea, is apropos here. And so the sense in which moral values are quote-unquote created is actually in the sense that morality itself is a sort of artistic illusion or artistic creation of forgetting the origin of where the value came from. But it's not a creation ex nihilo, as Jordan often presents it. And he presents it this way in order to call it impossible, right? So there's an agenda there. But it's a creation using the existing physiological valuations as the raw material. So it's creation ex materia, right? Which is clearly not impossible. And the legislators of value proceed by making a reassessment of which valuations are to be upheld as a moral law and which are to be minimized or excised from the collective moral consciousness. So, and this is the way Nietzsche talks about art in many places in his work, that the artist sort of exaggerates certain things, minimizes others, the way, the subject of a portrait, a painting of someone's portrait, emphasizes, puts someone in the foreground, and then everything else fades into the background, right? So it's artistic in that way. But it's not as if Nietzsche believed that this was the creation of values would be a type of creation that happens out of whole cloth, which would be an inhuman understanding of values creation. And so even the turn of phrase, create our own values, that Jordan uses all the time, in my opinion, it's something of a misnomer. Now, in the interest of intellectual honesty, Nietzsche does occasionally use this language. We can find a passage in which he does put it this way in Will to Power 979, quote, fundamental concept, the new values must first be created. This remains our duty. The philosopher must be our lawgiver, new species, end quote. But we should first notice that Nietzsche does not say, we ought to create our values, as Jordan often puts it. It's, and he doesn't say it's in the form of a structured philosophical anarchy. To be honest with you, I'm not even sure where he's getting that. Nietzsche's conception of how values creation happens is decidedly monarchical, and it's not anarchic. This is Will to Power 999. Quote, the order of rank, he who determines values and leads the will of millenniums, and does this by leading the highest natures, he is the highest man, end quote. But let us suppose, for the sake of argument, that anarchic values creation could happen. I think it is justifiable to say that Nietzsche would have claimed that state of anarchy will eventually yield up an order of rank according to the competition between forces that are in tension with one another. And in fact, Nietzsche sees no permanence, no enduring truths of what has been valued across the history of human life. He sees value constantly fluctuating according to which centers of power have coalesced and are able to, as Nietzsche puts it, subjugate others into their value system. This is Will to Power 715, quote, there are no such things as lasting and ultimate entities, no atoms, no monads. Here also permanence was first introduced by ourselves from practical, utilitarian, and other motives. The forms that rule, the sphere of the subjugated is continually extended, or it decreases or increases according to the conditions, nourishment, being either favorable or unfavorable. Value is essentially the standpoint for the increase or decrease of these dominating centers, pluralities in any case, for unity cannot be observed anywhere in the nature of development, end quote. Very important points there for understanding Nietzschean postmodernism, so to speak. But in any case, consider the language used. Nietzsche says that the philosopher, quote-unquote, determines values, and further, that it is according to nourishment, the favorable or unfavorable conditions, that settle which form of life shall rule. So in other words, we have language that does not point to whole cloth values creation. We get the sense instead that this is a matter of how values shall be determined, or we might say ordered, how the order of rank of values is to be determined. And we can even cross-reference Nietzsche's invocation of creating values in these unpublished notes with what he explicitly says that phrase means in his published work. And we can find this in that same passage I referenced earlier, Zarathustra's 1001 Goals. Quote, "Only man assigned values to things in order to maintain himself. He created the meaning of things, a human meaning. Therefore calls he himself man, that is, the evaluator. Evaluation is creation. Hear this, you creators. Valuation itself is of all valued things the most valuable treasure. Through valuation only is there value, and without valuation, the nut of existence would be hollow. Hear this, you creators. Change of values, that is a change of creators. Whoever must be a creator always destroys." End quote. So Nietzsche's understanding follows from that famous Protagorean dictum, man is the measure of all things. This is what is meant when Nietzsche calls man the evaluator. The power of human consciousness is found in the fact that we're able to make these sophisticated evaluations. And presumably, less complex life forms can't reevaluate their values in this way. They have to simply continue pursuing whatever their instincts have come to find valuable over long epochs, right? So perhaps their physiology will do the reevaluating, or perhaps an extinction level event does the reevaluating. But mankind has the capacity to consciously rank order its values. And that's the real meaning of the creation of values, or to speak more precisely, the revaluation of values. It means to place a value on the values themselves and determine which of them are the healthiest or most beneficial, which have the most utility and for what purpose. But the important point is that Nietzsche tells us straightforwardly, evaluation is creation. The creator of values is he who changes the existing evaluations, who redetermines them. This is both a creative and destructive act, as any reordering would be. See Will to Power 1007, quote, "Transvalue values." What does this mean? It implies that all spontaneous motives, all new, future, and stronger motives are still extant, but that they now appear under false names and false valuations, and have not yet become conscious of themselves. We ought to have the courage to become conscious and to affirm all that which has been attained, to get rid of the humdrum character of old valuations, which makes us unworthy of the best and strongest things that we have achieved. End quote. Thus, the act of creation is not creating the values themselves. The values are physiological, as we've already gone over. They're axiomatic in some sense, and they can't be created by the conscious mind. The act of creation is in changing the way they are rank ordered. The creation is a new tablet of values, a new rank ordering of values, daring to reevaluate those laws that were once held as holy or sacred. I mean, this is why it's also an act of destruction, to take those and place them on a lesser position in the order of rank, or daring to elevate that which has perhaps been denigrated to a higher position. So it would be an oversimplification to summarize Nietzsche's position by claiming that the legislator creates the values themselves. What he does is author a new tablet of values. He authors a new valuation of values. And once again, we have to recognize this as downstream from the instinctual and physical necessities upon which the values are based, what they're rooted in. And we have to recognize this as a process, not that might possibly happen in the future, but has happened many times, such as in the case of Plato or Muhammad. And it's not as if Socrates and Plato created, they create the new value of truth-seeking through the dialectic, but they don't create that out of nothing. As if human beings had never heard of such a thing as truth-seeking before Socrates came along, right? Rather, Socrates and Plato elevate the worth, the value of truth-seeking through the dialectic above other things that were previously valued more highly, such as the pride of the Athenians, the mindset in which the powerful person felt that having to give reasons for their beliefs was a sign of weakness, right? Platonic philosophy, conversely, sees this ability to answer for your beliefs as a strength. That's the nature of the reevaluation that Plato makes, or one aspect of it. And it would seem indisputable that he indeed did transform the moral universe of the Greeks and the whole Western world as a consequence. I mean, another figure that achieved such a revaluation was Jesus, in whose wake European cultures, in Nietzsche's reading, begin to turn away from worldly value. They begin to turn away from biological or physical quality, and they seek for otherworldly value. They seek for, what the thing of value is that which is aimed at the world of spirit. And it would seem hard to believe that Jordan would deny that Jesus accomplished such a revaluation, right? If Jesus indeed accomplished such a revaluation in the past, however, why would such a thing be impossible in the future? Unless Jordan really is just a dogmatic Christian at bottom who believes Jesus was God and Jesus can do a revaluation because he has a special power to do it. That's neither here nor there if he believes that. If we look at what Nietzsche said, on the other hand, Nietzsche obviously doesn't think Jesus was a supernatural entity, but he does suggest that it is through religion that these revaluations have been achieved. And again, this is throughout all of human history. So this is Will to Power 957. Quote, legislative moralities are the principal means by which one can form mankind according to the fancy of a creative and profound will, provided, of course, that such an artistic will of the first order gets power into his own hands, and can make its creative will prevail over long periods in the form of legislation, religions, and morals. End quote. And Nietzsche goes on to say in this same passage that his goal is aimed at returning the right to legislate values to the strong and well-turned-out type of individual, because the types of individuals who have been legislating up to this point have been the holy men. That's who we've entrusted the task to. There's another passage in Will to Power I'm not going to quote from here where he talks about the Manu law book, the caste system of India, where he says, you might expect Nietzsche to endorse such a thing, which I believe he does in one aspect of his published works, but in his Will to Power he suggests by placing the Brahmin, the priestly class, as effectively the people who get to set the values, right? Who get to be the moral arbiters of the community. This just shows that India has fallen victim to the same thing that every other society, in the West has fallen victim to. So returning to Will to Power 957, quote, the aim should be to prepare a transvaluation of values for a particularly strong kind of man, most highly gifted in intellect and will, and to this end, slowly and cautiously to liberate in him a whole host of slandered instincts, hitherto held in check. Whoever meditates about this problem belongs to us, the free spirits. End quote. So notice what Nietzsche says there. We can already see the revaluation occurring. We need to liberate in this new strong kind of person a host of slandered instincts, right? So that which was previously denigrated is going to be, we're going to adjust the tablet of values. And remember, instincts, that's the root of valuations, right? And this is because of the problem that Nietzsche sees with our current tablet of values. The priests, the ascetics, a type that Nietzsche would say is driven by resentment and defined by worldly weakness and vindictiveness, that's who's been allowed to take control of the legislation of values. So see, for example, Ecce Homo, Why I Am So Clever. This is part 10 again. Quote, all those things which mankind has valued with such earnestness heretofore are not even real. They are mere creations of fancy, or, more strictly speaking, lies, born of the evil instincts of diseased, and in the deepest sense, noxious natures. All the concepts, God, soul, virtue, sin, beyond, truth, eternal life. But the greatness of human nature, its divinity, was sought for in them. All questions of politics, of social order, of education, have been falsified, root and branch, owing to the fact that the most noxious men have been taken for great men, and that people were taught to despise the small things, or rather the fundamental things, of life. End quote. Also see Will to Power 685, quote, my general view of the world of values shows that in the highest values which now sway the destiny of man, the happy cases among men, the select specimens do not prevail, but rather the decadent specimens. Perhaps there is nothing more interesting in the world than this unpleasant spectacle. End quote. So, again, to summarize this second critique, to create values is to reevaluate them. What is authored anew is a new evaluation of the rank order of what is valued, a new determination of what that order shall be. And Nietzsche would say, this is not something that only might potentially happen in the future, it has happened in the past. And in fact, his entire project ceases to be comprehensible if we fail to understand that a revaluation of values is precisely what Christianity was. Now, let's move on to directly refute Jordan's so-called problems with Nietzsche's project. Jordan's problems with the values creation project of Nietzsche, they all fail. His main three problems are, the way he raises them in this particular lecture that we quoted from at the beginning, are as follows. First, if multiple people all create their own values, then we may, quote, fight each other to the death, end quote. So in other words, Jordan is focused on the utility of the collective thou shalt in maintaining the social order, and he believes that allowing individuals to create their own values will lead to a breakdown of the social order. Secondly, people in general cannot obey themselves. If we create a value and attempt to impose it, we have no guarantee that we will have the strength to actually live out that value. And then finally, he says we consist of multiple competing drives, many of which may have their own values, which may be contradictory. So it's essentially the first problem, but taken from the macro scale down to the micro scale. We should note that in light of the two misunderstandings that we've already sort of exposed here, some of the language that Jordan uses already sort of undermines his attempt to problematize Nietzsche. But if we look at that first objection, as I've kind of broken it down within this critique here, Nietzsche would argue that people fighting each other to the death over their values is simply a fact of life. This dog-eat-dog reality is what creates the necessities that bind people together under that same tablet of values, whatever it might be. If two neighboring peoples find themselves divided with fundamentally different interests or opposing ways of life, they have to fight it out to determine which of the two valuations of value is stronger. Does that bode well for the peace and harmony of society? No, but that's not Nietzsche's concern. And he doesn't promise that that will arise from his philosophy. Nietzsche never says that, in fact. What he says is that it's the collective's desire for safety and security that does encourage them not to take on the dangerous task of reevaluating values, right? That's something that the collective tends to fear, but that will not in the end preserve them. It will be their undoing. Supposing that if we take Nietzsche at his word that the values that have governed mankind up to this point are in fact nihilistic and harmful, then we will have to reevaluate them. It's not really a choice. So this is Will to Power 957. Quote, "At present, and probably for some time to come, one will seek such colossally creative men, such really great men as I understand them, in vain. They will be lacking until after many disappointments we are forced to begin to understand why it is that they are lacking, and that nothing bars with greater hostility their rise and development, at present and for some time to come, than that which is now called the morality in Europe, just as if there were no other kind of morality, and no other kind than the one we already characterized as herd morality. It is this morality which is now striving with all its power to attain to that green meadow happiness on earth, which consists in security, absence of danger, ease, facilities for livelihood, and, last but not least, if all goes well, even hopes to dispense with all kinds of shepherds and bellwethers." End quote. So I picked that passage to read because I wanted to just point out how Jordan's entire orientation in his reading of Nietzsche, of the problem that he raises, it's completely within what Nietzsche would say, the herd morality that wishes to present itself as the morality, as if there's no other kind of morality, and that anything that might disrupt security, absence of danger, ease, all of these things, just the order and stability of society. I know Jordan tells people to go out and face their fears and face danger or whatever, but in terms of the collective level, he thinks we should cleave to the traditional values. And Nietzsche says, yes, that's what the traditionalist or herd moralist will always tell you to do. And furthermore, Nietzsche doesn't imagine each individual becoming their own lawgiver or legislator, as we've already outlined. I'll just throw another quote at you. Beyond Good and Evil, Book 2, Section 29, quote, "It is the business of the very few to be independent. It is a privilege of the strong," end quote. So this, first problem that he kind of brings up, that we're all going to fight each other to the death, We need the collective thou shalt to maintain the social order. Well, it's a misreading because Nietzsche is not advocating for an anarchic process where everyone just determines their own values. And secondly, Nietzsche's entire problem with our current tablet of values is that it's degenerative. So it has to be shaken up. We can't just hold on to it. And the very problem are those like Jordan Peterson who are going to tell us, no, you can't do that. And another thing to understand, Nietzsche is not a universalist. This is something that Jordan's never really grasped. Nietzsche does not write to the entirety of mankind. He doesn't write to the great masses of people. He doesn't tell everyone to go out and create completely novel moral codes. That's a misreading. Nietzsche imagines that the vast majority of people, as what did he say earlier, they're accustomed by instinct to obey. So what will happen will be more like a competition between geniuses, or even between on the scale of nations, right? So extremely rare and extraordinary people like Plato or Jesus or Muhammad will author new tablets of values. They're going to win over great numbers of people to their new ways of living. Not only are the majority incapable of becoming legislators, most will not even want to. And though Nietzsche didn't imagine a chaotic anarchy of like every atomized individual becoming a legislator, even if that happened, he would argue that the competition between them would be productive. It would eventually lead to a new rank ordering. It would be a test, right? That would eventually produce a new tablet of values that would be widely accepted as it became determined unmistakably which values are the strongest. So in other words, Nietzsche welcomes the testing of values, but Jordan presents this as if it's a problem. But why is it a problem? And he doesn't really say, right? It's just assumed to be a problem because the stability of the existing social order is assumed to be good a priori. And I would also question, in what world does Jordan imagine that people will simply rationally debate their mutually exclusive moral values and not battle to the death? Did the Soviets and the Nazis settle the Battle of Stalingrad by appealing to universal moral norms or traditional values? Or did they fight it out by violence, right? We all know the answer to this. Jordan knows the answer to this. I brought up earlier the Greeks and the Persians. But Jordan wants to imagine there's like a way out of this situation by means of the dialectic, which to that extent his thinking is Platonist. So let's look at another one of his objections. The second objection, that people are not masters of themselves. This is even funnier to me, given Jordan's somewhat dogmatic position on free will. Jordan believes that human beings do have free will, and that the denial of free will is like a denial of human experience and agency. But if that is the case, then how could it be that we can't obey ourselves, right? Isn't that a denial of free will? The immovability of the will is actually an ancient problem in religion. It's not limited to people who create their own values. So many people accept the traditional values of Christianity, chastity, for example, or at least abstinence from sex until marriage, or whatever it might be, fidelity within marriage. And then they still end up engaging in adultery, or pornography, or masturbation, or premarital sex. So Jordan would, of course, I think he would have some explanation that involves sin, the propensity for human beings to miss the mark, like our inherent imperfections, as it were. But what is that if not precisely the absence of free will, right? And isn't the inability to obey yourself, isn't that an inability in that case to make one's will conform to the traditional and widely accepted tablet of values? If that can happen under the traditional value systems, why is this a special objection to Nietzsche's self-legislated value systems, if that makes sense, right? He says, your will can't conform to your own legislation of morality, but also your will can't conform to the collective legislation of morality. Your will can't conform to your I will, but it also can't conform to the thou shalts, right? So what's the special problem that he sees with the self-legislation of values? This isn't a point I'm really drawing on Nietzsche's work. It's just a logical inconsistency in what he's saying, and that the problematizing evaporates if we consider it this way. Now, ultimately, Nietzsche would argue that the people will obey these new valuations because the valuations become morals which have force behind them. So, what begins as a valuation, as that physiological demand, becomes a moral code, which becomes a law, which becomes enforced. It could be enforced by religious law, right? He discusses that in the case of Muhammad. Muhammad's revaluation of values ends with the imposition of the social order of Sharia upon the Arab world and beyond, right? It could be enforced through culture, sort of through soft power. It could be enforced through like raw political force and state violence. And so, whatever the case may be, Nietzsche would argue the way that these moral codes succeed in enforcing or imposing themselves has little or nothing to do with voluntary rational assent on the individual basis. It's whatever revaluation succeeds is going to be according to whatever new code of morals is best suited to the needs of the situation. And once that is discovered, so to speak, it will be enforced by the collective. See Will to Power 1008. Quote, any doctrine would be superfluous for which everything is not already prepared in the way of accumulated forces and explosive material. A transvaluation of values can only be accomplished when there is a tension of new needs and a new set of needy people who feel all old values as painful, although they are not conscious of what is wrong. End quote. So in other words, for the same reason that all values in the past attained power over human minds and human cultures, the new values will attain their own power according to necessities. And as he says here, according to which forces have accumulated, right? And why will there be a tremendous necessity? Because the old values are not working anymore. And people will follow those values that prove themselves life-promoting, life-preserving, and so on. However long and painful this process may be to find our way there. And Nietzsche, I think, is actually optimistic about this. That's the whole basis for his faith in the Overman, which we will get to in a little bit. But the fact that the individual human will is ever wayward, right? Ever misses the mark. That's not really a strike against Nietzsche's understanding, his argument of how values are formed. Because Paul himself says in the book of Romans, quote, for to will is present with me, but how to do good I find not. For the good that I would do, I do not. But the evil that I will not, that I do. End quote. So here's Paul, the great lawgiver of the Christian faith, who codifies the new set of values and gives meaning to the story of Jesus. He attaches a morality to the story of Jesus in the manner that, say, Plato did with Socrates. And here is Paul admitting he can't follow his own will. And yet he still manages to effect a revaluation of values in spite of that. So Paul, by his own admission, didn't need to be a master of himself in order to revaluate all values, which completely undermines Jordan's objection. And I think what Jordan is really attempting to put forward is this conception of just weakness and inadequacy of the individual, again under the assumption that each ordinary individual will have to create a new tablet of values for themselves from scratch entirely on their own. Again, if I thought he was being cynical about this, I would say it's a straw man, but I think he just genuinely doesn't understand Nietzsche. But psychologically, his approach reveals something about how Jordan Peterson really thinks, what he really thinks about the supposed power of the individual that he talks about so much. He thinks individuals are weak. He thinks they're prone to sin. That is what I really think is at the bottom of this objection to Nietzsche. Now, finally, the third problem, as I've identified it, is that, we have a number of competing drives or sub-yous within you, as Jordan puts it, that want different things. And one might attempt to follow one set of values, and a different impulse could attempt to follow another contradictory set of values. But as Jordan himself goes on to point out later in the lecture, Nietzsche himself was aware of this. In fact, Nietzsche is one of the first thinkers in the West to promote this subversive view of the self, denying the supremacy of the ego consciousness, and arguing that the physiology is where the activity is within the individual. The greater activity, as Nietzsche says, is unconscious. The self is a multiplicity and a unity. I'm not going to go as deeply into this aspect of Nietzsche's thought here because we've done a number of episodes on this topic as well. I'll also put some links in the description for this. But it's just another funny objection, given that it's a quote-unquote objection to Nietzsche's philosophy that's actually found in Nietzsche's philosophy. So it's not really a problem. It's another aspect of Nietzsche's thought that Jordan, I would argue, just misreads. So see Will to Power 492. Quote, the body and physiology are the starting point. Why? We obtain a correct image of the nature of our subject entity, that is to say, as a number of regents at the head of a community, not as souls or as life forces, as also of the dependence of each of these regents upon their subjects, and upon the conditions of a hierarchy, and of the division of labor as the means ensuring the existence of the part and the whole. We also obtain a correct image of the way in which the living entities continually come into being and expire, and we see how eternity cannot belong to the subject. We realize that the struggle finds expression in obeying as well as in commanding, and that a fluctuating definition of the limits of power is a factor of life." End quote. So a number of regents, to use Jordan's language, sub-yous, are what comprise the individual's subjectivity. Really, their body is what Nietzsche would say. Although he's careful not to essentialize them, right? Perhaps Jordan's sub-you is sort of essentialized because they're not souls or life forces, but we'll leave that to one side for now. There's a fluctuating power dynamic in which the drives enter into relations of command and obedience with one another. We can put it like that. And so we might say that just as this third problem is really like a microcosmic version of Jordan's first problem, the answer to this is really the same solution as it is to that first problem, just on the microcosmic scale, right? The tension between various drives within yourself is not actually anarchic, as Jordan presents it. It is a competition, it is a tension, but it's productive. It produces an order of rank. And ideally, this would result in one's drives following the most powerful of your values, right? But we know that that doesn't always happen in real life, and sometimes people follow life-destroying values. But as Nietzsche says in The Antichrist, the ill-constituted shall perish, right? So people who follow after harmful and self-destructive things naturally shorten their lives. So even an apparently, quote-unquote, incorrect outcome is part of an experiment conducted by life or by nature, which eventually produces a rank order of, we might say, the survivability of human behaviors. So above all, we can notice in all three of these so-called problems that Jordan raises, we can notice where his attention is. Jordan's eye is on the social utility of the value structure. He's concerned with whether a set of values fosters, whether it allows people to live peaceably and in harmony, whether the tablet of values allows the great many to live virtuous, productive lives. But that has nothing to do with the way Nietzsche thinks, right? Nietzsche believes that life itself is already undertaking this process, right? He constantly opposes himself to morality as such, not because he wants to destroy everything, but because he says most forms of morality have been anti-nature. And this is a result of the fact that civilization has been presided over by these decadent types of people, right? Ascetics, priests, and philosophers who are really just like a subspecies of priest. And they all have the aim of, quote-unquote, improving mankind. But you're trying to improve on something that nature has already figured out. And, Nietzsche explicitly says he's not concerned with improving mankind morally. So this is in Will to Power 981, quote, "We must not make men better. We must not talk to them about morality in any form as if morality in itself, or an ideal kind of man in general, could be taken for granted. But we must create circumstances in which stronger men are necessary, such as for their part will require a morality, or better still, a bodily and spiritual discipline, which makes men strong, and upon which they will consequently insist, and they will need one so badly, they will have it," end quote. Now, what Nietzsche's getting at here is what really makes people, quote-unquote, better are conditions that foster that great necessity. And this ties in with some of the most famous and quotable lines from Nietzsche, which have become cliches, but they're actually among the most well-understood of Nietzsche's thoughts because they're so straightforward. So, from The Gay Science, live dangerously, build your temples on the slopes of Vesuvius, or in Twilight of Idols, where he says, that which does not kill me makes me stronger, or in Beyond Good and Evil, what creates a free spirit is danger in the alley and in the heart. It's not under conditions of peace and stability and comfort that human beings improve, but under conditions of hardship and tension and competition that people are forced to become better. So, and I know Jordan does encourage people to face their fears, accept challenges, and so on and so forth, but what we're talking about here is his moral agenda. And it's not by giving people moral imperatives that they are improved. It's not a choice. And in fact, improvement happens when there is no choice. So morality for Nietzsche, it's a post hoc development. It's a codification of a set of valuations that have already been determined to foster life. And then, a legislator comes along, a genius philosopher or a religious prophet, they come along and they give a conscious and artistic order to that set of valuations. They make it conscious. They make it obtain over a whole culture or a whole civilization. And to the extent that this improves them, for one, it's not in any objective or progressive sense, since the values that foster life are relative and contingent, as we've already gone over. But in a sort of a broader sense, it's already been determined what the stronger values shall be, or what the most life-promoting values shall be. Or at least we might say there might be a limited set according to the given conditions or necessities that a people faces. And this is why a set of valuations that was appropriate in one circumstances, in one context, it could become out of date. It could become harmful in a future context. And so for Nietzsche, the future always requires new revaluations, but, so there are some areas where it almost seems like Jordan grasps what Nietzsche is saying. But if he really grasped it, he would understand you can't stay within your old tablet of values forever, which he always has sort of denied and ignored. Now, the final aspect of Jordan's presentation that I'm going to take issue with, it's only tangentially related to this overall topic, but it's worth discussing, however briefly, because of the fact that Jordan Peterson explicitly ties Nietzsche's project of values creation to the Overman, both in this lecture that I cited, but multiple times he does this. He sort of assigns the Overman as the figure who will create values, and that's another misreading. As we've discussed in past episodes, Nietzsche, for one, he doesn't use the language of becoming the Overman. He uses the language of letting ourselves go under, which means, somewhat poetically, to die, undergo a downfall. And he says, go under and bring forth the Overman. Perish attempting the great and impossible. So make your life one further step in a vast, almost inconceivably vast project across time for humanity. And he says the Overman shall be the meaning of the earth, that the Overman is a thing still to come. It's a flash of lightning in the distant future. Quote, I love all who are like heavy drops falling one by one out of the dark cloud that lowers over man. They herald the coming of the lightning and perish as heralds. Lo, I am a herald of the lightning and a heavy drop out of the cloud. The lightning, however, is the Overman. End quote. In other passages in Zarathustra, Nietzsche also sounds the theme of becoming forefathers and heralds of the Overman. But you will not find a line in Zarathustra in which Nietzsche writes that the point is for you to become the Overman, or for the individual human being to overleap their humanity, because that's sort of a denial of what you are, right? The relation of our own lives to the Overman is not insofar as we should strive to become the Overman, but again, that we should live in such a way that it creates the Overman. So we self-consciously manifest those values which are aimed at health and passion and ambition and worldly happiness and well-being, in contrast to the sickly values of the priests, which aim, in so many words, they aim at death. And that means, to bring forth the Overman, it means living not for self-preservation, which is ultimately of no value. The world is flux, right? It means living as the full expression of your own will. Become who you are, live dangerously, and so on. Be willing to die, because by living to the fullest, you take humanity a further step in the direction of becoming something greater than humanity. And Nietzsche makes it explicit. No one is an Overman in the present day. He writes in the section entitled The Priests, quote, never yet has there been an Overman. Naked I have seen both of them, the greatest man and the small man. All too similar are they still to each other. Even the greatest I found, all too human. End quote. So it's a common confusion among new readers of Nietzsche to conflate the Overman with the higher man, because Nietzsche has invoked the concept of the higher man to describe those philosophers who legislate values. But notice who's been included among those. Plato, St. Paul, Mohammed, and so on. Are these Overmen? Well, clearly not, no. These figures are, from Nietzsche's perspective, sick purveyors of ascetic values, for the most part. The fact that they are quote-unquote higher men does not necessarily make them worthy of emulation. They're all lawgivers, and yet they're not the Overman, right? So that should be rather clear. Nietzsche conceives of the Overman as, if we have to put it in concrete terms, it's sort of like a successor organism to mankind. But, there's serious complications on that. But just as man evolved from a less complex organism such as the ape, or, our common ancestor with the apes, we have to understand mankind, too, as something living and developing and growing and changing. So we're not a final form. That's really the claim that's being made at the basis of the Overman idea. It would be as ridiculous for us to claim that we are the goal and endpoint of nature as it would be for the ape to claim that the goal of nature was to produce the ape, right? So the Overman, as a concept that arises out of this understanding that life is moving, and our option is not whether to change or stay the same. See, Jordan would have us stay the same, right? But that's not an option. The option is rather we will change into something better and stronger and healthier and happier, or into something weaker and sicklier and more world-weary. This is also from Zarathustra. Quote, "I teach you the Overman. Mankind is something to be overcome. What have you done to overcome mankind? All beings so far have created something beyond themselves. Do you want to be the ebb of that great tide and revert back to the beast rather than overcome mankind? What is the ape to man? A laughingstock, a thing of shame. And just so shall a man be to the Overman, a laughingstock, a thing of shame. You have evolved from worm to man, but much within you is still worm. Once you were apes, yet even now man is more of an ape than any of the apes." End quote. So the reason why this is important is that the Overman is not the creator of values, so much as the notion of the Overman is itself Nietzsche's attempt at creating a new value. So it's a little backwards the way Jordan has it. It is the new value, right? The Overman is the new value. He's not the creator of new values. Nietzsche never says, become an Overman and then you can create values. What he really says, and here I'm paraphrasing, is, I've created a new value, and that value's name is the Overman. And it's unmistakably the language of a new value when he says, the Overman shall be the meaning of the earth. And that means we shall rank order the worldly, the physical, the physiological, over and above the otherworldly and the spiritual and the moral. So this is Nietzsche's own attempt to change the tablet of values, move some valuations up, more highly on the order of rank, which have previously been denigrated, and demote others. And it's not some impossible task. Again, it's been achieved many times. And Nietzsche is open about the fact that he's been inspired by other great lawgivers in this regard, even though he finds all higher men to be human all too human. Nietzsche's attempting to become a lawgiver in his own right, which is why he puts the words of Zarathustra into the mouth of an inspired prophet, right? Zarathustra instantiates that revaluation of values in the image of the Overman, among other images. Because if we look to all these past revaluations, usually, in the case of strict philosophy, it can be, but usually it's not in an abstract logical argument. It's in image and symbol and parable and narrative. So the religious lawgiver has always been a really powerful kind of lawgiver who doesn't teach in explicit abstract philosophical ideas. And that's why Nietzsche tries to harness that power by writing Zarathustra in the style of the New Testament, and that's why he fills the text with stories and riddles and enigmatic scenes and so on and so forth. Now, again, this is really not the most important part of my argument, but it simply reveals yet another, frankly, unforgivable misstep in Jordan's reading. The confusion about what the Overman even is, and the idea that it would require an Overman, or that it would require that we ourselves become the Overman in order to legislate values. But again, there has never been an Overman, but there have been past legislators of value. I hope that's clear from the direct sources that we've looked at today, and from a careful reading of those sources. The Overman isn't a savior who comes and gives us a new tablet of values. The Overman itself is a new central orienting value, in the same way that Christians, used God or Christ in their old value structure, insofar as the Overman is the new thing to sacrifice for. It's the new thing to give one's life for, to give one's life meaning, as Jordan would put it. And meaning's very important to Jordan, right? So, and just see, thus spoke Zarathustra, the Isles of the Blessed, quote, "Once did people say God when they looked out upon distant seas. Now, however, I have taught you to say Overman," end quote. And so those are all my major critiques here, and so we'll conclude. Nietzsche's project has nothing whatsoever to do with telling the average person that each of us needs to make up a completely new morality, as if such a thing would be possible or desirable. And I would argue it's hardly even conceivable. And if that's what Nietzsche's project was, then Jordan would be correct that it's an inadvisable philosophy to guide us into the future. But as with many aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy, much of what he has to say about the legislation of values is descriptive rather than prescriptive. He's explaining to us how moralities came into being, how this happened in the past, right? And how the spark that fires that creative process, that creative destructive process, is like it's the genius within a philosopher or a prophet or a religious figure who takes that raw material of the physiological demands and affects a revaluation through this artistic act of reordering, of making it conscious, and of turning it into an idea. And Nietzsche recognizes that the end result, the universal moral law, the thou shalt, is, as we said at the outset, it's a reification of instinct. It's an abstraction, a universalization. And the lawgiver misleads himself and everyone else by forgetting what it was in its origins. What Jordan is talking about, on the other hand, is like the individual applying his own intellect to come up with some new consciously articulated set of ethical maxims, according to like his own strength of reason and his own discipline. And quite in agreement with Nietzsche, Jordan concludes that most will be unable to do this. But as Nietzsche tells us, philosophy really needs to be studied psychologically, and we have to think about the moral or immoral germ out of which the entire plant of Jordan Peterson's philosophy has grown, and it's very clear. The entire purpose of Jordan's rhetoric on this topic is to direct us back to the traditional values, to convince us that in spite of the death of God, the alternative to the old central orienting value structure of Christianity is anarchic chaos, right? Or worse, totalitarianism, so we just can't go there. And he invokes a Christian conception of mankind's weakness, frankly, by pointing out the limitations of our intellect, the waywardness of our will. In effect, all of our hubris and sinfulness. Look at you, you sinful wretch. How could you be so prideful as to think that you could reevaluate your values, right? That's impossible. People are so pathetic and unable to have self-discipline and unable to follow their own willpower, and therefore the only option is the pre-existing doctrine and dogma of Christianity. Now, aside from all the interpretive problems that I've raised, this just fundamentally fails to tangle with Nietzsche's actual criticisms of Christianity. Nietzsche's actual criticism of Christianity is that it's a secret path to nothingness. Nietzsche argues that it represents the investment of all of our valuing capacity into the world beyond, orienting our lives around a moral project to be humble and unambitious and follow the conventional rules and values and reject the pleasures of the flesh and so on, so that we can have salvation in an afterlife. And Christianity promotes values such as pity, and it raises those values to the highest rank. And what does pity do? That gets us to turn our attention primarily to the suffering of the world, which is very central to Jordan's ideology. And Christianity spreads suffering. That's what Nietzsche says about it. It makes it contagious. And what does that do? It makes life look less appealing than it would be otherwise, which in turn makes Christianity even more appealing because it offers salvation from life. And finally, Christianity is fueled by resentment and the bad conscience, and just all these pathologies of the conscious apparatus, which effectively deal with unexpressed cruelty within the human organism by turning it back onto itself. And so the guiltier you are under the Christian set of valuations, the better of a person you are. The more you say, I'm a sinful wretch, the more penitent you are. There's no real possibility for a human being to be good in the Christian view. They can only really repent for being bad. And so people strive to repent as hard as they can, to feel guilt as thoroughly as they can, as a path to holiness. These are the sick values that Nietzsche criticized, that he saw as effectively poisoning the human psyche for thousands of years. And it's not an option for Nietzsche to simply cling to the wreck of Christianity, because Christianity is shipwrecked for a very good reason. It's a dead end. It's a form of nihilism. And without a revaluation, those sick values will just continue to push mankind in a sick direction. And if that happens, rather than, the next phase of human existence being happier and healthier, it will be a form of life that is sadder and sicker and just worse in every way. And in all of his discussion of Nietzsche, Jordan never answers those criticisms of Christianity. He prefers to portray Nietzsche's assessment of the death of God as if it's all about like scientific truth overcoming biblical revelation or whatever, right? But he ignores the passage in Zarathustra, for example, where it's stated, God died, he choked to death on his all too great pity. He never talks about that. When we contrast Jordan's statements with what Nietzsche actually wrote, none of his problematizing of Nietzsche's project really, it doesn't work. It doesn't work on any level whatsoever. It's a complete misreading at best, and it's a straw man at worst. And arguably, that's because his goal is really to get us to ignore all of these problems with Christianity and flee back into the peace and safety of a new dark age, in which the old values are worshipped again, without the chaos of a potential revaluation coming along. But, as we've already gone over, that's exactly what Nietzsche warned about, was this type of person. And so at this point, it has to be recognized, Jordan Peterson's entire project is diametrically opposed to Nietzsche. To the extent that he uses Nietzsche, it is a misuse. You should not trust his interpretation of a philosopher who he's entirely opposed to in every way. And not only does he employ Nietzsche in order to pursue exactly what Nietzsche rejected, but just, his entire understanding of Nietzsche's philosophy turns it on its head. For whatever virtues that many people find in Jordan Peterson's project, I would just conclude by saying his interpretation of Nietzsche's project badly misses the mark. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.